Welcome to Echo and Ash, and thank you for tuning in to another original audio experience. Today, we are beginning a brand new storyline titled Silent Breath. This is episode 1. Please sit back, relax, and let the story unfold.
Silent Breath, Episode 1, Act 1. The Embarkation. The port of Valparaiso, Chile, was a vibrant chaos of cranes, cargo containers, and shouting dock workers. But towering above it all, pristine and impossibly massive, was the Oceanic Serenade. It was a marvel of modern maritime engineering, a brilliant white leviathan stretching over 1,000 feet long and rising 18 decks into the crisp blue sky. For Arthur and Evelyn Pendleton, standing at the base of the gangway, the ship represented the culmination of a lifelong dream. Arthur, an 82-year-old retired architect from Seattle, leaned heavily on his wooden walking stick. He craned his neck backward, his pale blue eyes tracing the sweeping lines of the ship's hull. "It really is a floating city, isn't it?" Arthur murmured, adjusting the brim of his canvas sun hat. Evelyn, his wife of 50 years, linked her arm through his. She was a practical woman, organized and sharp, holding a thick folder containing their boarding passes, excursion tickets, and dining reservations. "It had better be, Arthur, given what we paid for the balcony suite. Come along now. The line is moving, and I want to unpack before the muster drill." They joined the slow, shuffling procession of eager vacationers. There were nearly 2,600 passengers boarding that day, a sea of rolling suitcases, tropical shirts, and excited chatter. They were families, honeymooners, and retirees, all seeking a 14-day escape down the rugged, breathtaking coast of South America, ending in the icy fjords of Patagonia. Deep inside the ship, far from the champagne reception in the grand atrium, Dr. Marcus Vance was enjoying his final moments of absolute quiet. Marcus was the chief medical officer of the Oceanic Serenade. He sat in his office on deck 3, sipping a lukewarm cup of black coffee. He was in his late 40s, a former emergency room attending physician from Chicago who had traded gunshot wounds and car crashes for the predictable rhythm of cruise ship ailments. His head nurse, Elena Rostova, knocked briefly before pushing the door open. She was carrying a thick stack of medical inventory manifests. "We are fully stocked, Dr. Vance," Elena announced, her Russian accent clipping the ends of her words. 2,000 doses of motion sickness medication, enough antacids to neutralize a volcano. And the trauma bay is prepped, though I pray we do not need it. Marcus smiled faintly. "If this cruise is anything like the last one, Elena, our biggest trauma will be someone slipping on the pool deck after too many margaritas. Let's keep it that way. Once we leave port, we are on our own." The great horn of the Oceanic Serenade blared, a deep, resonant vibration that rattled the coffee cup on Marcus's desk. The ship was casting off. The voyage had begun. Act 2. The Routine of Paradise. The first 3 days at sea were a masterpiece of choreographed luxury. The Oceanic Serenade glided through the Pacific waters with barely a tremor. For Arthur and Evelyn, life fell into a delightful, lazy rhythm. Mornings were spent on their private balcony, drinking room service coffee, and watching the endless expanse of blue ocean. Afternoons were for reading in the ship's massive library or attending lectures on South American wildlife. Arthur, an avid amateur ornithologist, had spent months reading about the rare avian species native to the coastal rainforests. Down in the medical center, Dr. Vance's days were exactly as he had predicted. The clinic saw a steady trickle of minor inconveniences. Sunburns from passengers who underestimated the equatorial sun, indigestion from the 24-hour buffets, a sprained wrist from a spirited game of shuffleboard. It was an enclosed, perfectly controlled ecosystem. Every surface on the ship was scrubbed, polished and sanitized twice a day. Hand sanitizer stations stood like sentinels at the entrance to every dining room. The air conditioning pumped crisp, heavily filtered air through miles of hidden ventilation ducts. To Marcus and to the thousands of passengers above him, the ship felt entirely safe. It was a fortress of steel and glass, isolated from the unpredictability of the natural world. But nature, Marcus knew from his years in medicine, was endlessly patient, and it was waiting for them at their very first port of call. Act 3. The Excursion. On the morning of Day 4, the Oceanic Serenade dropped anchor off the coast of Puerto Montt, a gateway city to the dense temperate rainforests and glacial lakes of southern Chile. The air outside was different here. Gone was the crisp ocean breeze, replaced by a thick, heavy humidity that smelled of rich soil and decaying vegetation. The ship lowered its tender boats, ferrying hundreds of eager tourists to the mainland. Arthur and Evelyn were in the first group ashore. They had booked the premier excursion, a guided bird-watching trek deep into a protected ecological reserve, promising sightings of the elusive Chucao tapaculo and the Magellanic woodpecker. Their guide was a young, enthusiastic local named Mateo, who led their small group of 12 passengers onto a rattling minibus. They drove for an hour, leaving the bustling port town behind, climbing higher into the verdant emerald-green mountains. "Keep your voices low from here on out, my friends," Mateo whispered as they stepped off the bus at the edge of the forest trail. "The canopy is dense, and the birds are very shy. We will hike about 1 mile to an old observation blind. It is the best place to see the nesting grounds." The hike was strenuous for Arthur, but he pushed through, leaning heavily on his walking stick. The forest was breathtaking. Giant ferns brushed against their legs, and ancient trees draped in moss towered above them. After 30 minutes of slow trekking, they reached the observation blind. It was an old, dilapidated wooden structure built on stilts, blending into the surrounding trees. It had a rusted tin roof and a long horizontal cutout serving as a viewing window. "This blind has not been used much since the heavy rains last season," Mateo explained, pulling heavily on the swollen wooden door. It groaned open with a loud screech of rusted hinges. The inside of the blind was dark, dry, and incredibly dusty. The air was stagnant, untouched by the forest breeze. As the 12 tourists filed into the small space, their boots shuffled against the wooden floorboards. Arthur walked to the far corner to get a better angle at the canopy window. His boot caught on a loose floorboard, and he stumbled slightly, his walking stick striking the base of the wall with a loud thud. The impact disturbed something hidden in the dark, dry space between the walls. A massive cloud of fine, gray dust billowed out from the floorboards, catching the shafts of sunlight piercing through the viewing window. Along with the dust came the distinct, musky odor of dried rodent droppings, long forgotten in the abandoned structure. Arthur, standing right in the center of the dust cloud, inhaled sharply in surprise. He breathed in the stagnant air, the dust particles, and the microscopic aerosolized pathogens that had laid dormant in the dry darkness for months. He coughed a few times, waving a hand in front of his face. "Goodness, it is dusty in here," Evelyn whispered, pressing her lace handkerchief to her nose. "I'm fine, Eve," Arthur rasped, clearing his throat. He pulled his binoculars up to his eyes, ignoring the slight tickle in the back of his throat. "Look, up in the highest branch of that cedar. Do you see it?" For the next hour, they watched the birds. The dust eventually settled back onto the floor. The air cleared. Arthur took picture after picture, entirely unaware that the most dangerous wildlife he had encountered that day was not in the trees, but deeply embedded in the delicate lining of his own lungs. Act 4. The Return. The group returned to the Oceanic Serenade just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a fiery orange glow over the water. Arthur felt a deep ache in his legs, which he readily attributed to the mile-long hike through the uneven forest terrain. He and Evelyn took a hot shower, dressed in their evening attire, and made their way to the main dining room on Deck 5. Dinner was a grand affair. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and waiters in white jackets glided between the tables, carrying plates of seared scallops and filet mignon. "You barely touched your steak, Arthur," Evelyn noted, sipping her red wine. Arthur looked down at his plate. His appetite, usually robust after a day of walking, was completely gone. A strange, heavy lethargy was settling over his shoulders. It wasn't just the tiredness of old age or exertion. It felt deeper, as if his very bones were made of lead. "I think the hike just took it out of me, dear," Arthur replied, forcing a reassuring smile. "It was quite a climb. I think I might skip the theater show tonight and just head back to the cabin to read." Evelyn looked at him with mild concern but nodded. "All right, I'll come with you. We have a long day of sailing tomorrow anyway." They walked back to their balcony suite. The corridors of the ship were bright and bustling with people heading to the casino and the lounges. To Arthur, the walk from the elevator to their room felt twice as long as it had that morning. Act 5. The First Breath. It was 2 a.m. when the subtle shift occurred. The ship was silent, gently swaying in the deep ocean currents. Inside cabin 8042, Evelyn was fast asleep, her breathing steady and rhythmic. Beside her, Arthur lay awake in the dark. He wasn't in pain. He didn't have a fever and he wasn't coughing. But he felt incredibly unnervingly hollow. He stared up at the dark ceiling, listening to the hum of the ship's air conditioning. He tried to take a deep breath to calm his racing mind. He pulled the air in through his nose, but the breath hitched. It felt as though an invisible barrier had been erected halfway down his chest. The air simply wouldn't go deep enough. He tried again, opening his mouth this time. A shallow, silent gasp. His chest barely rose. Arthur sat up slowly, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He felt dizzy, the room spinning slightly in the darkness. He placed his hand over his heart, feeling it beat a little faster than normal, working harder to pump what little oxygen was making it into his bloodstream. He didn't want to wake Evelyn. It was just fatigue, he told himself. Just a bit of shortness of breath from the humidity in the rainforest. It would pass. He just needed to rest. Arthur laid back down, closing his eyes. He took another short, silent breath, unaware that deep inside his lower lobes, the microscopic invaders were rapidly multiplying, silently destroying the cells responsible for oxygen transfer. The haunting had begun, and they were 1,000 miles from the nearest hospital.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the story, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for the continuation of this series as the unseen threat begins to spread through the ship. Until then, stay safe and thanks for watching.